Good evening and welcome to the lecture series hosted by the Spanish Fork Historic Preservation Commission. My name is Kevin Euler and it's my privilege to be able to introduce our guest tonight. Laura Dixon calls herself the Liberty Lady and is a traditional constitutionalist. She has studied and taught the making of America and the 287 principles of the U.S. Constitution in the tradition of the founders for over 15 years. Those two principles, which were put in place by the American founders, led to the most free and prosperous nation in the world. With only 6% of the world's population, these traditional principles of freedom and prosperity empowered America to produce over 50% of the world's wealth, as well as created the most generous people in the world, which has given more money to impoverished nations and peoples over the past 200 years than all other countries combined. Laura has served as a board member and regional director for the Thomas Jefferson Center for Constitutional Studies. Laura lives in Spanish Fork with her husband Richard and loves all things American. She is active in family history work, quilting, weaving, playing pickleball, and spending time with her grandsons. Please join me in welcoming Laura Dixon.
Thank you for that thank you. I'm a little nervous, can you tell? Would it be okay if we stood and did the Pledge of Allegiance first before I started? Would that be okay? I brought my own little flag. I'm all prepared. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Everyone should have gotten a Constitution and an extra piece of paper with the thing about the signers of the Declaration. If you didn't, raise your hand because we're going to actually get into the Constitution a little bit later. Okay. My name is Laura Dixon, as we talked about already, as it was introduced, and as one who suffers from taphophilia, I want to tell you I feel right at home. And if you don't know what a taphophilia is, it's a condition that that causes one concern for all love of all things about dead people, specifically epitaphs and headstones and artifacts and journals and old pictures. And so speaking to the Historical Preservation Commission, I think you're my people. And if you are not a taphophiliac, rest assured it usually is not contagious. Usually, and I haven't been in a cemetery for over a week, so I think you're going to be okay. I am coming off of a little cold, though, and so I do have a residual cough, but I don't think I'm contagious with that either, so I hope that's okay. I would like to start tonight by moving this piece of paper, by setting the stage for the topic which I will be addressing. So considering that we're meeting here in November, and last week was Veterans Day, and are there any veterans with us today? Is anybody a veteran? Kind of? No? Okay. Well, I would like to tell you I am a daughter of a Vietnam veteran and a granddaughter of a World War II veteran. And I think it would be okay for us to acknowledge the work and the effort that they put into fighting for this country that we love. And some of those might have been difficult conflicts, etc., but still those who went to war or went to battle or who sacrificed deserve our respect. So, talking about Veterans Day, next week we celebrate Thanksgiving, where we're going to remember our pilgrim heritage, which, talks about giving gratitude to God for the land on which they landed. And then I think you will agree with me that we probably just survived one of the most difficult election cycles that we've probably ever witnessed in our lifetime. And I don't care what side you're on, both sides will say that it was a difficult time. And then in September, which was right before election, we celebrated Constitution Day on September 17th of this year. So with all of those things as the backdrop, I've entitled my topic today, America Worth Fighting For, and how to protect and defend today what they fought for yesterday. And I'm hoping that will be interesting to you. And I want to start by telling you a dream that I had a little while ago. In my dream, I was minding my own business, And up behind me came my brother-in-law, and he was carrying a pocket Constitution. And he was carrying a pocket Constitution like the one I gave you. And if you look at yours, you'll notice that it looks different than mine, right? Now, without looking at Google or without asking Siri, if you can tell me the difference, after we're done, the difference between the Constitution that I've given you and this one, besides the fact that mine has George Washington on it, I may have a prize for you. Okay? All right, so in my dream, my brother-in-law comes up with a pocket Constitution, and he's a little frantic, and he pokes me, in behind. And as I turn, I notice he's a little frantic, and he starts asking me a question as he's shaking the Constitution. And he says, here's the question: how do we protect and defend the First Amendment? Well, what would you say? With the Second Amendment. That would be hilarious. That's not what I said. You know, when you're dreaming sometimes and you're like, I kind of wonder what I'm going to say. You know, you kind of will yourself to stay asleep, so you kind of want to know the rest of the story. Well, that's kind of what happened to me. And I kind of wondered what I was going to say. I mean, where would you start? If someone asked you about that, where would you start? Usually when the topic of the Constitution comes up, eyes glaze over and distractions happen, you know. Luckily, when I was invited to go about 15 years ago to my first constitutional lecture, my first thought probably was actually boring. But luckily, I liked my friend enough that invited me that I didn't let that stop me. And so when I went to my very first class, I was grateful, and I think that my teacher probably knew that starting with the boring and the technical stuff wouldn't probably get you to come back. He started by telling stories I had never heard before. He started telling about the founders, and he started talking about their lives and their wives, the sacrifices that they made, the things that they endured. And by the time he was done, I was enthralled. Is that the right word? And I couldn't get enough. And I realized that what had happened was he got me interested in the people, because when you hear a person's story, that's not usually boring. And then by the time I understood more about them and what they had done, then I was able to be in a position where I could appreciate what they put in place and what they gave to us. So tonight, I'd like to start by telling you a few stories about those who fought for the American ideal, or the idea that is America, throughout history. And then as a little teaser, I'll tell you what happened in what happened in my dream. And then that will give us some practical ideas of how we can protect and defend today what our founders fought for yesterday. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to a woman and a warrior who I like to call the first great American. And of course, you know her as Joan of Arc. Don't freak out just because she's French. I promise it will all make sense. So let me tell you a little bit about Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was born in 1412 in Domremy, France, which is up in the northeastern part of the country. It's called the Lorraine Valley. She's the youngest of 5. She has 3 older brothers and 1 older sister, and she's born to a Catholic peasant family. And she's taught to take care of the household, but never to read and write. She couldn't read and write. She also couldn't ride a horse. She says that she wasn't really good at needlework. She wasn't as good as her mom would have liked her to be, but she was proficient, and it was okay. And everyone in the town would tell you how much they appreciated the peacefulness and the joy that came from Joan of Arc. She's born late into the 100 Years' War between England and France. And there is a prophecy about this time in France that goes something like this. It said, France would be ruined by a woman and afterwards restored by a virgin from Lorraine. And Lorraine is the area in which Joan of Arc was born. Now, you can go back and look at that history of France and kind of determine what that looked like for the woman who ruined France. But it is undisputable that this maid from the Lorraine Valley, who was a virgin maid, saved France. And when she's 12, she starts hearing voices. And at first, she hears these voices, and they tell her just to be a good girl and go to church, and which she does because she is a good girl. Soon then, she starts having visions of angels. And I don't know, she names some of them. She tells us that she sees St. Michael, the archangel. She sees St. Catherine from Alexandria, who was a virgin martyr from the 4th century. She sees St. Margaret of Antioch, who was beheaded for refusing to deny the faith. She sees Gabriel, among other angels. By the time she's 16, these angels start telling her a little bit more about what her mission is supposed to be. They tell her that her mission is to save France by getting the crown prince crowned as King Charles VII and to drive the English out of France. She's told that she needs to be a maid to protect her purity, and that she will do this as she leads God's army. Well, her dad gets a little nervous because whenever you would hear at this point of time women who would follow after the army, what do you think it really is that they're doing? They're probably prostitutes. And her father actually tells her older brothers, if you see Joan start to head off after the army, I want you to drown her, because I would rather have her purity intact and in the afterlife than for her to live her life as a prostitute. Luckily, her brothers don't do that. In fact, 2 of her brothers follow her on her quest and join in with her. She makes her way to see the Dauphin, or the crown prince, and it takes some miracles for her to get to that point. He knows that she's coming, and he decides he's going to play a little trick on this 16-year-old girl. So he takes his courtiers, and he puts one of them up where the king or the crown prince would usually sit, and he put himself down with the courtiers to try and trick her to see if she would know who he was. Well, they didn't have Facebook. They didn't have pictures. She had no idea what he looked like. But she walked in the room, looked around, and recognized that it wasn't him, and she went right up to him, who was standing in this group of people, went right up to him and said, I'm here to make sure that you're crowned. Well, I don't know that he really believes her, and so she tells him a secret. She tells him, and it's disputed what it actually is that she says to him, but she tells him something that only he knows, which convinces him then to make her the general of the French army. She is made a suit of armor, which has tunics and cords to protect her virginity, to protect her modesty, and to keep her from harm and impropriety, and she cuts her hair. And that's important because girls had long hair, right? You didn't cut your hair. She was told by her voices that there was a sword for her in St. Catherine's Church. So she sends her guards to go to the St. Catherine's Church, and I don't know if you knocked the altar over or something, but they found this sword, which was St. Catherine's sword, and it was a smaller sword. It was a feminine sword, and she never uses it to kill anybody or to hurt anybody. You want to know what she does with it? She chases all the prostitutes out of camp with it, because this is God's army. And she institutes a military code of conduct, which is unlike anything that the world had ever seen before. It basically said there will be no drunkenness, no swearing, no impropriety, no prostitutes, no gambling. You cannot rape, pillage, plunder, and steal. And not only that, but men, you needed to go to communion, and you needed to do confession. And that was what she required of her men that followed after her. She is the only female soldier in the history of the world who has had the supreme command of a nation's army, and she was only 17. She leads the army. She leads the Dauphin to Reims, where he gets crowned as King Charles VII. And when he asks her, she's standing next to him when he gets crowned, and when he turns to her and asks her what kind of a reward she would like, she doesn't ask for anything for herself. What she says is, taxes are a little bit of a problem for my town. Could you make it so that my town doesn't have to pay taxes? And for 350 years, France did not have the town of Domremy pay taxes. Isn't that fantastic? And then when he gets crowned, she thinks she's done. So she asks her voices, can I go home now? I mean, who wouldn't want to go home? I've done the work I've meant to do. And her voices say, no, you're not finished yet. They lead her through many other battles and victories. And she knows, her voices tell her that actually she will be wounded and captured, and that she will probably be martyred. Not probably, but that she would be. She knew that she would get wounded above the breast, and she knew that she would be captured, and she knew it would be in less than a year. So as she's going along and they're having these battles, the day comes when she does take a crossbow in the chest, and the English capture her. She's eventually captured and tried in England in a criminal court, where she's guarded by men who threaten her virginity, and at this point she's 18 years old. Now, the problem is she's being held in a criminal court, and she's tried in England for the sin of heresy. Now, a heretic is one, let me quote you the definition. A heretic is one who is considered to be a heretic when they belong to the church, yet adhere to any religious opinion which is contrary to the official doctrine of the church. Well, she was charged with cross-dressing, which was an affront to God, because she dressed as a man, she cut her hair, she fought as a man, she took communion as a male, and that was something that the church did not believe in. She also heard voices, and according to the religious doctrine of the day, that meant you were a witch, because only witches heard voices. So all of these things were contrary to the church doctrine and the beliefs at the time, and heresy, in case you didn't know, was punishable by burning at the stake. So the English don't allow her to be ransomed. And even though it's a heresy and a witchcraft trial, right, which are contrary to the religious doctrines of the day, and even though it's the religious leaders who accuse and question and convict her, the English don't technically allow her to be tried in a religious court, which would have allowed her to have been guarded by nuns. She is tried in a criminal court, which causes her to be guarded by male guards. So to answer for the crime of cross-dressing, she promises. She says, I will put off my male attire. I will let my hair grow. It won't be a problem. And they say, okay, great. So they gave her a dress. She puts it back on. And as soon as she puts her woman's clothes back on, she is attacked a number of times, has to fight off her attackers, and quickly goes back to putting her tunic and her cords on that protect her modesty and her virginity. And this allows the church to denounce her now as a relapsed heretic, which is even worse than just an initial heretic. She's also threatened with torture if she doesn't deny her voices. Well, she doesn't deny them. She is eventually burned at the stake at the age of 19 on May 30th of 1431. And as she's standing there, she openly forgives her accusers for what they're doing to her, and she asks them to pray for her. And her last dying words were, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. So Charles VII now has a problem because he recognizes that his place on the throne is a little tenuous if the person who put you on it is a heretic. And so by 25 years later, he begs for her trial to be reopened so that they can re-look at all of the evidence to see if really she was a heretic, because that would make his position to his claim to the throne a little bit stronger. So finally, the church opens her trial back up in 1455. And we know all of this because the English courts kept such good records of everything she said, everyone who testified against her. Mark Twain actually goes to the archives and studies. For about 15 years, he writes this book about Joan of Arc. He publishes it when he's 61, and he says that it is the most important work that he ever does. In fact, what does he say? He calls Joan the most extraordinary person the human race has ever produced. In 1909, the church finally beatifies Joan, and that declares her to be in a state of bliss and on the path to sainthood. She's canonized and declared a saint in 1920, which is about 400 some odd years after she's burned at the stake. So it's interesting that she's canonized by the exact same church that burned her at the stake. Now, I'm sure you're asking yourself the question, like, okay, that's great, but what's so great about Joan and America? So hang on to that question for a minute, and hopefully it will make sense. I wish that we had the time to be able to move forward on the timeline and come and talk about Christopher Columbus a little bit, who also fought for an American ideal, who's being vilified today as one who was just in it for the slaves and for the silver. He wanted to just settle things and conquer, and that is not true. If you read his story and you read his words and his books, you will see that he actually believed that he was called of God to be a Christ bearer. That's what his name means, to bring Christianity to those places of the world where there were lost sheep. I wish we also had time to move forward on the timeline and talk a little bit about our pilgrim heritage, the pilgrims who came and settled our country, but we don't have time to talk about them. And so we're going to scoot forward about 300 years from Joan of Arc, and we're going to come to the next great warrior, which also is known as the father of our country, and that would be George Washington. So George Washington is born in 1732 in Virginia to a wealthy tobacco farmer, but he's the oldest son of a second marriage. So when George is 11, his father dies, and the estate actually goes to his older brothers. So he's not left with any provision in his father's will to continue his education. So his education really stops there, his formal education. And at that time, he also inherits 10 slaves from his father's estate. He's appointed a county surveyor by the time he's 17, and he travels to Barbados when he's 19 with his brother Lawrence, who has some health issues. And while he's in Barbados, he contracts smallpox, and he lives. And you see the evidence of God's hand in this, because then during the Revolutionary War, when smallpox would go sweep through the camp, George Washington was unaffected. That is the only time George Washington ever leaves the North American continent, was when he goes to Barbados with his brother. He serves in the King's military during the French and Indian War in the 1750s, and when he's 23 years old, he earns the name of the Bulletproof George Washington. After 17 clear shots missed him, 4 of which went through his coat, 2 of which shot horses out from under him, the great Indian chief is said to have proclaimed, quote, "This man was not born to be killed by a bullet." And then the same Indian chief goes on to declare that people yet unborn will hail him as a founder of a mighty nation, a mighty empire. Upon becoming the head of the Continental Army then during the Revolutionary War, he was never once wounded. He also institutes a military code of conduct. And it is based on the same military code of conduct that Joan said that the angels told her to institute during her war in the 100 Years' War. So George Washington's military code of conduct included no cursing, no swearing, no drunkenness, no gambling, no prostitutes, and that the men attended church and received communion. Now, the interesting thing about this is that George Washington himself never takes communion during the Revolutionary War. And people would say today, well, that proves that he's not religious, that he doesn't believe in God. But that's not true. The fact is that the head of the church was the king, the very king that Washington was fighting against. And he felt that that would be a conflict to ask for forgiveness and protection from the very person that he was so avidly fighting against. He recognizes the hand of providence in his writings. He talks no later than 34 times that the hand of providence protected the army through miracles during the Revolutionary War. And this is where Joan comes back in. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress, you will remember, they called upon France to help us. They needed France's army to be able to combat France's navy to combat England's navy, which was the mightiest seafaring group in the world. Without Joan of Arc protecting France from England in her day, there would have been no navy to come and protect us and help us in our day, and we would not have won the war. So this is where we say Joan of Arc becomes the first great American, because without her, we wouldn't have been able to succeed. So thank you, Joan. Let's just give a moment for her. After the war, George Washington, see, I'm a little nervous. My throat's a little dry. I'm on camera. But I'm grateful that there are friendly faces in the audience. After the war, George Washington goes on to preside at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and he becomes the first and only president ever in the United States to be unanimously elected by the Electoral College on April 6th of 1789. And then he's elected unanimously again for a second term. He refuses to be elected for the third term, and he wants to go home in 1797. And he lives for 2 more years at Mount Vernon, and in 1799 he dies at the age of 67. I'd like to move on to Thomas Jefferson. He was also called upon to fight for the idea of America, but he did it in a different way. He was born in 1743 in Virginia to parents that he loved dearly. So when his father dies at the age, or when Thomas is 14 years old, it's a little... I don't want to say devastating, but it was difficult for him. Not only did his father die when he was 14, but because he was the oldest son, that makes him the head of the family, and he inherited the family estate. And just like George Washington, he inherits slaves. His father's will provided for him to continue his education, so he does, and he learns to play the violin. And this is kind of a funny little story, because this is an appropriate movement for a man to make in the 1700s. It is not appropriate for a girl to do. So you will not have found women who played the violin during those days. Their job was to play the pianoforte. They could keep their arms down because this was more appropriate. So Thomas Jefferson's wife played the pianoforte, and he would accompany. They would do duets. And I think that's great. I'm glad that we can play violins today. I don't, but I think it's awesome for women who do. Let's see. He speaks 5 languages fluently. He enters the College of William and Mary at 16 as an advanced student, and his personal library eventually becomes the basis for the Library of Congress, with over 10,000 of his own books, which he cataloged by size. During the early days of the Revolutionary War, he's called upon to write the Declaration of Independence, and he uses words like, "when in the course of human events." And then, standing directly against the principle of slavery, he continues with these famous words, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that phrase, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, was actually borrowed from John Locke, who was a philosopher that died 40 years before Thomas was born. But he studied him in school. And in John Locke's writing, actually, it never says life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It says life, liberty, and property. So the question then becomes, why would Jefferson have changed that last word from property to pursuit of happiness? So I'm going to give you the short answer. The short answer is because slaves were property. And even though Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder, he was doing everything that he could to get rid of slavery in America. In fact, he actually compiled a formula which would have eliminated slavery in one generation. And had it been adopted, it would have saved us from the Civil War. So while we're here, let's take a few minutes and talk about the elephant in the room, which is slavery, shall we? I've already told you that Washington and Jefferson inherited slaves, and they were not the only ones. We always think that, well, if they were really against slavery, that they could have just stopped it. They could have just let their slaves go free, so why didn't they? So what you need to remember is that slaveholders were slaveholders under the British government and British laws, and that meant the king. And if you did not have an heir to give your estate to upon your death, then all your property would revert back to the crown and the king would reapportion it. And that included, technically, all of the property that was attached to the property, buildings, articles, anything, and that included slavery, or the slaves. So if you didn't have a place for your property to go through inheritance, primogeniture is what they called it, then it would all revert to the king, and he would take an accounting of all of that property. And if you did not give everything back, he would come for you. That included slaves. So we always think of slavery as an American problem. It was not. In fact, England doesn't get rid of slavery until like 1830, which is well after we were supposed to get rid of it according to the Constitution, which said it should be done, no more importation of slaves until after 1808. That's what Article 1, Section 9 says. So if we consider that slavery was not just an American problem, it was a universal problem throughout the whole world. And in the British colonies at the time of the Revolution, there were even free blacks who owned slaves. So under English law then, you were not allowed to just free a slave without the permission from the king or his representatives. And if you could get the crown to manumit or allow a slave to go free, which was rare, the law stated that they had to have a way to provide for themselves so that they wouldn't become a burden on society or the churches. So they would have to have a craft of some sort. Also, if a slave was to become free, the law stated that they would have to leave the community so that they wouldn't incite riot or jealousy with slaves who were still enslaved. Well, here's the problem. Jefferson and Washington, among others, allowed their slaves to marry. This meant that for them to set one of them free, it would probably destroy a family because that one that they set free would have to leave the community. So what would you have done? If you were in debt, the law would take your slaves to pay the debt. They would sell them, and that's how the debt would get paid. You could declare a slave free in your will as long as you provided for them until they died, and provided you weren't in debt. Well, Thomas Jefferson dies in debt, so he cannot set his slaves free. Washington doesn't die in debt, and so he, in his will, makes provisions for some of his slaves to have freedom, but he cannot provide for all of them. Not only that, half of the slaves, I don't want to say half, a number of the slaves that Washington had within his family responsibility came from Martha, from her first husband. They were not his to do anything with under the law. So this is the issue that we have with slavery. And even after we become a country, those laws are still in place. It's so entrenched that you cannot just let your slaves go free. So we have to look at this issue of slavery through their eyes and their lens and their context, not ours. And what I like to say is if we're going to judge them for what they did to slaves, then they get to judge us for what we're doing to our unborn children in abortion, right? Because their context and our context are so different. Okay, Thomas Jefferson goes on to die on July 4th of 1826, which also is the same day that John Adams dies. I find that fascinating. They die on the same day of the document that they were both that they had a hand in writing. One who didn't physically fight but fought powerfully with words and principles then, let's move on to Benjamin Franklin. He is the youngest son of the youngest son going 5 generations back. He's born in 1706, and in his lifetime, he goes from being a meat eater to a vegetarian and back again. I'm sure you'd be interested to know that he began our country's first fire department and that he advocated for the importance of lighthouses because he was almost shipwrecked once. He started our nation's oldest fire insurance company, which is still in business today, and he's also the reason we have daylight savings time. You could take that up with him later. He is 81, and he is the oldest signing member of the delegation to sign the Constitution, and he weeps when he does. He outlines the 5 fundamental points in all sound religion, which are found in all of the principal religions of the world at the time. This is what he said: there is a God in heaven who created the universe, and he ought to be worshipped. That God revealed a moral code of behavior which teaches right from wrong, and that God holds mankind responsible for the way we treat each other, that all mankind lives beyond this life, and that in the next life we will be held accountable and judged for what we did here. Now, he and the other founders of the day looked upon these fundamental precepts of religion and morality as the cornerstone of a free government. In fact, it was John Adams who said that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. I think Benjamin Franklin understood that we would need to continue the fight for what they gave us in the Declaration of, and the Constitution, because my favorite story about Franklin is, and this will illustrate why I think he knew that it would still be a fight. When he comes out of the Constitutional Convention, a woman stops him on the street and she says, "What have you given us, Dr. Franklin?" To which he replies, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." I think he understood that it would be something that needed to be continually worked towards and protected. Now, that leads us to a quick aside. What type of government do you believe that we have today? And if you answer with the word democracy, you would be mistaken. The Pledge of Allegiance states, "And to the republic for which it stands." Now, you may want to evaluate why we keep calling ourselves a democracy in our day and age when our founding fathers did everything they could to actually avoid using that word. Okay, now, after discussing a few of our founders, this all begs the question then: is what they gave us in the Constitution and the Declaration worth defending still today? They mutually pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And do we feel willing to do the same? The Revolutionary War was fought from 1776 to 1783. That was a 7-year-long struggle. The Constitutional Convention won't happen for 4 more years after that in 1787. And then it takes 2 more years after that until the 9th colony ratifies the Constitution and we actually become the United States of America in 1789. That's 13 long years to build our country. Since then, the United States Constitution has become our country's greatest export. It is the oldest written constitution in the world that is still in use today, and it's over 230 years old, and every nation in the world, except 3, have adopted written constitutions, and ours is the model for them all. Now, I thought maybe I'd ask a question and say, if you could come up and tell me what the 3 are, maybe I'd give you a little prize at the end. What I found was people came up and they were so shocked, because usually the answers are like, well, I'm sure it's like North Korea, or I'm sure it's communist China, or something like that, and those answers are all wrong. It's actually surprising that the 3 other countries are New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and Israel. And it doesn't mean that they aren't constitutional bound. They have strong traditions of constitutionalism. It's just that their governing provisions aren't collected in a single written document. And I find that fascinating, because ours is the template for all of the other constitutions in every single country throughout the world. That tells you that it's something important, and that other countries thought it was important too. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about some founders, we've talked about a constitution, we've talked a little bit about the Revolutionary War, I want to invite you to participate in some constitutional exercises with me so that we can see if we can still find the principles that are in the Constitution worth defending. You want to join? Nod your head, let me know. Okay, so I want to invite you to participate with me. And we're going to start with the preamble of the Constitution. Now, the purpose of the exercise is to remind us what's in the document, and then to look around today and see how it's working and ask if it still needs protecting and defending. Okay? So, Gouverneur Morris, before we open to the preamble, Gouverneur Morris, whose name means governor in French, but he was not one, he is considered the penman of the Constitution, and he's the one who polished the final language as we know it today. And he's the reason that we say, what do we say? How does it start? Why am my brain going? He's responsible for, we the people. He's responsible for saying we the people of the United States, because without him, this is what we would have had to have said. You ready? We the people of the United States, we would have said, we the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So I say thank you to Gouverneur Morris, too. Gouverneur Morris actually had a carriage accident when he was younger, and his leg came off, so he had a wooden leg. So at the Constitutional Convention, instead of clapping, he would stomp his foot. Anyway, okay, so let's open up now to the preamble of the Constitution. It's on page 1, and if you don't have it in your Constitution, you can read this. Okay, let's read it together, can we? That be all right? It starts with we the people. Here we go. Ready? We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Okay, so within that preamble, there are 6 purposes for government. And they are to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So would you agree that these things are worth protecting and defending still today? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so now let's ask a couple of questions then, shall we? If we believe that these things are worth defending and protecting today, would you say we have a more perfect union of states today? Do you think all the states get along and support each other? How about justice? Has justice been established equally and across the board? Is everyone treated the exact same way under the law today? How about domestic tranquility? Have you felt tranquil lately? How about your common defense? Is our common defense being provided for in our country? Article 1, Section 8 says that our government shall have the power to repel invasion. Are they? How about your general welfare? This one's important because it's general welfare, which means that it generally applies to all of it. It's not specific welfare. It's general welfare. Does it feel fair to everyone equally throughout our country? How about our blessings of liberty? Do you feel like they're secure for you and your posterity? So I'm going to leave it to you to answer the question. Do these first 52 words need protecting and defending in our day today? I believe they do. And that's the first paragraph of the Constitution. If we were to continue with this exercise, we would get to Article 1, Section 8, where the founders outlined the 20 powers given to the federal government, which do not include anything about electric cars, health care, climate, marriage, personal income taxes, etc. And then we'd find ourselves in Article 2, Section 2, which outlines the 6 areas of presidential responsibility, the last of which is that he is to take care of the laws that they be faithfully executed. And then we would have to ask ourselves a question that might sound something like this. What in the world has happened? And this is where I have to tell you, I don't have any answers. Really, I don't. I don't know how we go about fixing it. I can see what's wrong, but there is no easy button. And it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum that you fall on or identify with, both sides will tell you that there is a problem today. But I'm here to give you the good news today. And that's where we come back to the original question that was in my dream. How do we protect and defend the First Amendment? The original document of the Constitution is only 7 articles long. The first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were given to further constrain the federal government. In fact, 3 of the delegates from the Constitutional Convention did not sign the Constitution because it did not have a Bill of Rights attached to it. In fact, one of them said he'd rather have his right hand cut off than sign the document without the Bill of Rights. So when George Washington promises that the first order of federal business would be to address those further restraints, then those 3 men went home to their states and advocated for and campaigned for them to join the Union. True to his word, the Bill of Rights was sent to the states for ratification by George Washington in December of 1791, which was 2 years after he took office. Now, this is what I want to make sure that you understand. Governments, especially our government under the United States Constitution, governments are instituted to protect and guarantee rights, not to give rights or things to people. Because the mere fact, if you have the ability to give something to someone, then you have the ability to take it away, and that is not what our founders meant. They put protections in place to limit the federal government and to preserve what God gives to each and every one of us, and this is called our right of conscience. This makes the Bill of Rights then the good news of the Constitution. So let's turn, I think it's on page 21, we're going to turn to the actual First Amendment. Page 21 in your book. And let's read what it says, shall we, about the First Amendment, because I'm sure you're interested to know the answer about how do we go about protecting and defending the First Amendment. Okay, so let's read it together, okay? You see where it's at? If not, it's right there. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Okay, 5 points in this amendment, and it begins with the words, Congress shall make no law. So this is a restriction on the federal government, and it's designed to protect the rights of every citizen in every state in these 5 areas. It's important to recognize that it means the federal Congress, not our state. State is different. We're talking about the federal government at this point, okay? All right, so the 5 points then, the first one is religion, and I don't think that that is by accident. So if you identify, or if you can define what you believe the word religion would be, it encompasses so much more than just a religion. It encompasses everything that you think. You are free to believe, think about, dream about whatever you want to believe, and you get to practice it. That's what free exercise means. So you can pray in public, you can do your ministering in the grocery store if you want, and as long as it's ethical and moral and causes no one any physical harm. Because like my 7th grade a social studies teacher taught me, my rights end where your nose begins. So I am not allowed to physically harm you. Okay? Now, people will say today, well, you might say something that hurts my feelings. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about physical harm. Okay, so that's what religion means. Then you have speech. What is the point of speech mean, right? Well, once you decide what it is that you believe, then you get to talk about it. You get to talk about what you believe to everybody and anybody who will listen. And you do not get to be silenced. And as long as it is moral and ethical, again, and it doesn't hurt anyone and cause physical harm, you get to talk. You could say any words you want to. You probably shouldn't say, fire in a theater. It's not kind. That will cause physical harm. But you get to say what it is that you believe. And then the freedom of the press means you get to print about it. You can print about it, you can write a letter, you can write a book, you can start a blog. You can even write about it on Facebook and Instagram, detailing everything that it is that you believe. And then after that, you get to assemble. You are guaranteed the freedom to meet with other people and talk to them about and discuss and even try to persuade them to your way of thinking. You can meet anywhere. It does not have to be in your house with the windows closed or in a church on Sunday. It can be anywhere. And then redress. If somebody doesn't like what you believe and how you go about acting upon it, and they try to stop you, you can petition the government for a redress of your grievances. And if you are staying within those moral and ethical grounds, then you should be vindicated. So here's the question. How can you defend your right to worship outwardly and openly today? And this is where we come back to my dream. It was so simple and so surprising to me what I learned in my dream that I had to wake up and write it down so I wouldn't forget it. I mean, I have taught and studied the Constitution for over 15 years. I think I know some stuff. I don't know some stuff. I had never had this thought before, and it's so simple and so astonishing to me that I'm grateful to be able to have the opportunity to teach it. So here's the answer. To defend your right to worship the way you believe, you worship. You go to church, you live your religion, and you allow others to do the same thing. You pray in restaurants, you minister in Costco, right? And then how do you protect and defend your right to speak? You speak. You say what you believe, you do it kindly and civilly, but you don't allow the opposition to shut you down for speaking what you believe, and you allow others to speak what they believe. Do they have to like what you say? Nope. Do you have to like what they say? Nope. Do you have to believe what they say? Are you going to be right all the time? Probably not, and neither will they. But that's beside the point. The point is that each of you are guaranteed the freedom to say what you think without being stopped by a government. So, how do you protect and defend freedom of the press? You write, you print, you articulate, and you record what you speak and what you believe. And then, how do you protect your right to assemble? You assemble, just like we're doing tonight. Do you see a pattern? And when others infringe upon those rights, you use the laws that are put in place to petition for redress. Now, what if redress doesn't work and you still are shut down and your rights are abused? You stay within the laws civilly and respectfully, and you allow God to justify your beliefs and your actions. Remember what Benjamin Franklin said in the 5 fundamental purposes for religion? That God holds mankind accountable and we will be judged for how we treat each other here on this earth. And that's an important principle. Okay, this principle of understanding how to go about protecting and defending applies to the whole Bill of Rights. It applies to the whole document, in fact. And you want to protect and defend your guaranteed right to bear arms? Guess what you do? You keep and bear arms. Now, I totally get that there are some of us who don't want those in our homes. That's completely fine, but you can defend your neighbor's right to do it. I remember the first time that I was questioned on my belief about guns and how I thought that they killed people. They hurt people, and I thought maybe we should have some regulation. Don't judge me. I was really young. And I had a friend who grew up in East Germany before the wall came down, and he and his family were blessed to get out, and they came here to Utah, and they settled. And he asks me one day in his big German accent, he asked me if I understood why we had guns in this country, and I am sure I said something so articulate, like hunting or food. And I am so grateful that he was patient enough with me, this dumb American who didn't even understand the basic fundamental God-given right for gun ownership. And he said something to the effect of, you have the right in this country to own guns to protect you from your government. I did not have that in my country, and we were forced to live in a way that we didn't agree with, and we couldn't fight back against it. And that changed my life forever that day. That's why I'm here today, because of what that German taught me, this dumb American who thought she knew so much, right? Because guns hurt people. If guns kill people, then forks are the reason that you are fat. Right? Okay, so you want to protect and defend your certain unalienable rights of life, liberty, and property? Then you defend them. You defend life everywhere, even in the womb. You want to defend liberty? Then you stand with those whose liberties are under attack, even if you disagree with them. You stand with them. Because if their liberties can be taken away, then so can yours. You want to pursue happiness? Then you probably want to protect your private property rights. And you probably want to protect those physical things that you need to make you happy. Home ownership, vehicles, those types of things that allow you to be able to pursue happiness any way that you want. We are to build on what our founders gave us. And when we choose not to wake up or to become active in however we feel motivated, I promise you that that will lead to a further decay of loss and freedom. This is the price of freedom, and it is worth fighting for. Who is willing to bear the cost? Because our founding fathers did. I choose to stand with them in protecting and defending today what they so valiantly fought for yesterday. I want to say God bless you, and God bless America, and thank you.